This program is brought to you by SoundsTrue.com. At
Here's a woman
you
who
can
has
find hundreds of
fallen in
downloadable
love
audio learning
with the
programs,
cell.
plus books,
Now,
music,
first of all, do you think
videos,
that's fair to
and
say
online
that you've
courses
fallen
and
in
events.
love with the cell?
At SoundsTrue.com, we think of
Absolutely.
ourselves as
In
a
fact,
trusted
before,
partner on the spiritual journey.
This conversation, I was spending some
Many
time with them
voices,
and realizing
one journey.
I really had fallen in love with them, and I can have a real relationship with them. And it may sound crazy, but
You're listening to Insights
one of
at
the
the
names
Edge.
I wanted to give
Today
the book
I
was
speak
Romancing
with Dr.
Yourself.
Sondra Barrett.
Okay,
Sondra
so
is a
tell me what you
nationally
mean that you
recognized
were
speaker
spending some
on
time with
mind-body
yourselves.
medicine.
I mean, aren't we always
She
spending,
earned her
that's all we
PhD
have
in
is
biochemistry
ourselves. What do you mean
from
by
the
that?
University of
That's
Illinois
true.
Medical School
Well,
and completed
I
postdoctoral
went
training in immunology
took some time to
and
meditate,
hematology at the
and
University of
basically asked
California
my
Medical
cells
School.
what they wanted
She
me
was
to
taught
say,
at UC Berkeley,
what was the most
UC
important
San Francisco,
to them.
and the California
one of the
Institute of
reasons
Medical
I
Studies.
say this is
With Sounds True,
it brings me back
Sondra has
to
a new
when
book,
I was writing
Secrets
this book
of
and
Your
teaching a
Cells,
workshop
Awakening the
at
Body's
Noetic
Intelligence.
Sciences. And
in
I
which
was
she
having a really
explores
hard
our
time
body's
teaching the
cells
workshop because I
from
was so
perspectives
into
both
my head.
scientific and sacred.
I was in the science mode.
In this episode
And
of
I
Insights
went into the
at
garden
the
on
Edge,
Sunday
Sondra and
Sunday
I
morning
spoke
and
about her
said,
background
I've
in
got
cellular
to shift
biology.
something because
We also talked about how our
I'm
intelligence
not revealing the
lives
cells
within every cell
from their
of our
spiritual
body
perspective.
through the
I'm not
fabric
revealing.
of our
I'm not sharing my
cytoskeleton.
heart. I'm just not.
And
in,
finally, and
I'm
most
just in
importantly,
the intellectual
we talked
space,
about
and
the
that's
lessons
not my
on
experience
living
of the cells.
that Sondra
So I
has
sat in the
learned
garden
from
and
tuning to
went
her
through one of my
cells, what she
rituals,
calls
which
our
was
greatest living
thanks
ancestors.
for being here. Thanks for being
Here's
my
my
support
very
team.
intriguing
And
and
I
provocative
hear
conversation
this,
with Sondra
where is
Barrett.
it coming from? I don't know, but what I hear is, you finally got it, thanks. And then this conversation that is coming from somewhere else other than my intellect was telling me how the cells have been carrying me along to transmit or send this information out. And it took me, to someplace else that this wasn't possible, except people talk to plants, people talk to guides. Guides give them information from outside of their intellect. And I was able to go back into my workshop and come from a deeper place, the place of really being in love with my cells and being in love with life. So, I was a little nervous about doing this podcast and, what can I say? How am I going to answer questions? And it's like, no, remember who we are. So it's like, yeah, they're always here, but are we in conversation with them is a whole other story.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for speaking from your experience and being willing to speak vulnerably and transparently, because I really appreciate that, and I think we need more of that. So I just want to begin by thanking you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
And I want to continue on that vein, which is help me understand how you experience intelligence or wisdom coming from your cells, not coming from what you're describing as the intellectual processing of life.
So you're asking not to scientifically describe their intelligence, but how I experience it?
Yeah. Let's start there.
Okay. Well, sort of to bridge the science, because I think that's really important for me and your listeners, is the cell's intelligence is embedded in their fabric, in their innards, inside, and it's their strings. So if we think of our cells as being constructed of strings, what we know about strings is they resonate with sound. Stretching and moving them influences how the strings impact the cells and what the cells decide to do. So how I access that intelligence is I work with sound, and I can work with sound, and it takes me into a more peaceful place. I can do Qigong, I practice movement. The practices that I talk about in the book are all practices I've been doing and teaching for basically decades. I just never had an explanation of how it might work in the body. Mm-hmm. I just did them because I felt better for doing them. So it's like, well, now I know where cellular intelligence resides, at least we think that this week, and how I access that place is then doing some of these practices that make me feel more whole, and get me out of my, doldrums and my depressions and everything else. So, and I think, again, because I do have that scientific inclination, because I know there's a physical structure now that can be accessed with many healing practices, especially sound and movement, that it convinces me that what I'm doing isn't a waste of time if I think I'm wasting time by what are you humming M for, go to work.
Well, I'd like to understand more about the strings inside the cell. Take me inside the cell and help me understand this cellular intelligence as you see it, as you experience it.
Okay. Well, first of all, we know for years we thought the genes were the intelligence, and Bruce Lipton has done an amazing job to teach people and excite people about their cells. And his perspective is it's the receptors on the cell membrane that are receiving information. That's the intelligence. And I was thinking about that yesterday and realizing, that's forgive me for being. For saying that's the male scientist perspective, that it's on the outside of the cell where intelligence resides. In fact, Donald Ingbar, scientist in Harvard, at least 15 years ago, I had written about the fabric of the cell. He calls it the architecture of life. And what he basically showed was that the receptors don't work. Receptors are antenna. They're picking up information. But what responds to the antenna is this fabric of tubes and strings and microtubules that runs throughout the cell. Now, a lot of people, when I learned about cells, we heard the term protoplasm. It was like there's gel in the cell. That's all we knew. And, now because with new technologies, people were able to show, no, there's this underlying webbing that connects the cells from side that connects the outer to the inner, and that the mechanical tension on that fabric or on those cells, the forces on those cells, influences what the cells choose to do. And so what Ingbar showed, which to me, was life-changing for me to read about this. What he showed in a dish, if you put cells in a plastic dish and you're trying to grow them, when the cells are stretched out, they express one set of genes, the genes to keep on reproducing themselves. When the cells let go of some of that tension, they're not holding so attached to the dish, they start maturing. So the cells have the same genes in them. The only thing that's changed is the tension on their fabric. And then when cells fully let go of their tension, another gene is expressed, the self-suicide gene, death. So purely on a physical level, we've seen that mechanical stresses on our cells influence basically their decision-making, which genes they express. And then, it's, of course, which activities are they doing based on the structure of their cells? Are we, I look at it in terms of real life. Well, am I stressed out, strung out, or I'm all balled up? What is our postures do to ourselves? What is letting go do to ourselves? How do we put that into real life?
You're saying a lot of different things, and I want to see if I can tease out some of them. So
Okay.
you mentioned the receptors on the outside of the cell that Bruce Lipton has said they're very important in cellular intelligence, and you said that was a masculine form. So how does the receptors interrelate with what you're describing here as the strings and the level of tension inside the cell?
It was when I listened yesterday to your podcast with Bruce, that's why I was thinking, he's thinking the external, which is where we all start, and a feminine perspective of science may be the inside, the hidden. And so the receptors of the cell, just like he has said and Candace Pert have said, they're receiving information. They're receiving the chemical information, the molecular information. If we're stressed, the body's going to be churning out a lot of stress molecules, epinephrine, cortisone, etc. And the receivers on the cell, the antenna on the cell, will attach to those molecules. It's like the radio. We've got these receivers or these antenna. But until we turn the knob and change things inside the cell, there's no response. So you've got these receivers. I've got all this adrenaline on my cell, on the surface of my cell. But the cell has choice-making in that at some deep level in terms of what makes the cell respond. Just receiving the information doesn't automatically make the cell respond. You see what I'm saying? The receptors are connected to the fabric.
Yeah.
And maybe it's become semantics, whether the brain is on the outside of the cell. To me, the brain is on the inside of the cell.
Yeah.
Because with all the receptors loading up the surface membrane, that isn't all it takes for the cell to respond. If the cell's fabric doesn't respond, there is nothing happening.
Yeah. Well, whether the brain of the cell is on the inside or the outside or both, it's a pretty big leap, I think, still for most people to believe that intelligence isn't located in the brain, but that it's located in the cells. That's already a pretty big leap for most people, wouldn't you say?
Well, there's different kinds of intelligence, isn't it? I mean, the intelligence that operates us is purely at a cellular level. I mean, each cell is, a community in itself, and then the community of cells does hold us as living sacred beings. And I think, if we think about people, most people think of intelligence in the brain in our heads. Well, the brain does a lot of the orchestration of sending out molecules and things like that. But who's running the brain? I mean, where is mind? Which is another quality to me of intelligence. Where is consciousness? How does that influence us at a physical level? And you may be familiar with Stuart Hameroff's work. He's down at the University in Arizona. And what Hameroff and Penrose have basically tried to show us, and I think fairly convincingly, that actually the fabric, the microtubules in the cells, are the place where consciousness flows. So that there's some more evidence for people who need it that intelligence and consciousness can actually be found from cell to cell.
Now, I think it might help our listeners, though, to get a little more familiar with how you fell in love with the cells, your cellular romance, if you will. So maybe you could briefly give us that background story on your cellular romance.
Sure, love to. I was trained as a biochemist. So in going for a PhD, basically I'm working with isolated chemicals how, trying to understand actually how did the influenza virus infect cells, but it was from purely chemical perspective. I went and took a postdoc in immunology and hematology at the University of California, San Francisco, and I chose a project that was as close related to biochemistry as possible because I didn't really know cells. I knew chemistry. And so the project I chose was one that worked with looking at little boys had a genetic disease in which they were dying of infection. And my job was to figure out why. Why weren't these cells working? So I immediately had to start looking at cells under the microscope. And once I did that, it was like this light went on. One, it was amazing for me to see, these little human white blood cells, if I put them on a microscope slide and throw in a couple plastic beads, these cells know that there's something strange there, and you see the cells moving under the, through the microscope, going for these plastic beads. And I thought it was totally incredible for me. It was just a whole new world that not only did I fall in love with cells, it took me more to, God invented these. he, she, they designed these. These are pretty wise warriors that know what to do. It isn't just an accident of biological evolution. So it was like that aha moment of, really seeing them under the microscope, seeing everything under the microscope, changed my perception for sure of life.
Now I'm curious, Sondra, it seems that there's an underlying assumption in your work, and tell me if this is an assumption or if this is something that you feel really solid behind or what, which is that what we discover about an individual cell, we can say about an individual human organism, that they're analogous in some way. Is it fair to say that that is an assumption in your work?
That is an assumption. That basically that I'm projecting that the cellular behavior.
Well, I'm glad you said it, not me. Anyway.
No, totally. It's like I could see everything they were doing. I'm projecting into another language, one of human life and spiritual life. So it's definitely an assumption.
Okay, and help me feel comfortable with why this assumption works for you. I mean, I understand that it works in the world of poetry, but you're a scientist.
Right.
So how does making an assumption like that, there's a parallel between the function of the cell and the function of the human being, how does that work for you that you're comfortable with it?
Maybe some of this comes from my backstory or my work, spending years and years, doing things under the microscope. One, in the early days of my doing science, I was developing diagnostic tools of human leukemias. And what I observed was, and I'm sure this was one of the turning points, what I observed was, when you look at those cancer cells or leukemia cells or cancer cells of the white blood cells, when you look at them under the microscope, they're absolutely chaotic in what they look like, how they develop. There's no order at all compared to a normal white blood cell. And I then leaped to, those cells create chaos in the body, and they create chaos for the person, and they create chaos for that person's family. So I was looking at a lot of this whole concept of form and function, that what they do, what cells do, what they look like influences what they do, and extrapolating, I guess that's all I can say, extrapolating that each stage of what they do in terms of a perfect example is the receptor story is so well known to a lot of people. if we think about these molecules that are receptors on the surface of a cell, those molecules, proteins on the surface of the cell, must embrace the messages. They're just not accidental. So there's a real connection between molecules that fit each other. So each step along the way, and they've got to embrace. And if I started reading Teilhard de Chardin, who talked about if there wasn't embrace in the molecules, there couldn't be embrace in us higher ups. Love couldn't exist. So I began reading more of the literature that theologians were writing about biology. And each time I would think about, like cell sanctuary. In the beginning, I study science, and how did that first cell get formed? Well, molecules had to come together and form, Donald Deamer is one of the first people I became aware of who talked about life needs a place. So until we have the molecules that formed a place for the energy of life and the innards of the cell to form, we don't have life. And so it's like, that's creating sanctuary. The molecules are creating sanctuary for life to occur. So each time I was learning about another part of the cell, it became easier and easier for me to see how that was so in real life. And because, what can I say? Because I have had an experience of the imagination and shamanic practices and other ways of knowing ourselves, it became easier and easier for me to make that wild leap, that what the cells do, they really are our teachers if we pay attention. Everything they do for life, we need. Everything they need, we need. And I tend to like to translate it into a more sacred literature just because that's who I am at this point in my life. I wouldn't have done it 20 years ago, I am sure.
Well, let's take the leap with you. So we're going to leap with you, and we're going to say that we can learn from ourselves about being a human being, and we can learn from their wisdom. Tell us what some of the most important lessons are that you think we can learn from ourselves.
Oh, okay. One of the most important lessons, I think, is the letting go. Again, going back to that intelligence of the cell, when the cells are fully attached to this dish, they're going to keep on repeating their patterns. When we're fully attached to a certain way of life, we keep on repeating ourselves. We're not changing. If we let go, in Buddhism, they'll say, let go of your attachments. You become more spiritually mature. Well, you see that, I see that in the cells. When the cells let go of some of their attachments, they're not so rigid in their holding on. They now become mature, because cells can only basically exert either or. They're either reproducing, they're attached to the old program, or they're maturing. And then they had to let go of that old program and turn on another one. All the programs were there. Mm-hmm. And then when they fully let go of any of their old programs, they program cell death. They die. And to me, this has become really important in having conversation with a friend who leads cancer support groups. He's now I think now in his 6th year of being in remission from pretty advanced lymphoma, and he was I had this conversation with him. It's like, well, what do you see in people who go into remission when it's not expected? Or how did you go into remission when the doctors didn't expect you to at all? And he said, what he tends to see, And I don't want to make people wrong who don't go into remission, and not saying it's all a question of what's in your mind and letting go. But what he had seen was that the people who really let go of something big in their life, those people went into remissions, not expected. And so when I started having a conversation with him about the cells, it's like, oh, well, when the cells fully let go, they're turning on another gene program which has those cells, which has cells die. So the question I have, will be an interesting research protocol somehow, is it possible when we let go of something really important that's holding us into certain patterns that perhaps we can, the cells that are holding on to the cancer pattern can receive the message to let go? We don't need that pattern anymore. We don't need you to grow anymore. We need you to program death.
Now, let me ask you a question, Sondra.
Sure.
If I was doing a type of letting go practice, let's say I was doing some kind of breathing where I was exhaling and really visualizing, not holding on to anything at all. So I engage in a deep practice like that. What would be happening as I was practicing in that way in my cells? How are my cells responding as I'm doing that type of practice?
Great question. This is extrapolation. How I suspect your cells are responding in that, they're in a state of resonance, in a state of peacefulness, all of them. So there isn't a tug on them that's saying, you should be struggling about X, Y, or Z. In that letting go, all of our cells go into this place of, they're playing the same song. There's a peacefulness that if you're in that letting go practice, I'm sure you're aware of. And if we think about, then what's happening at the cellular level, their strings that inside of them is vibrating all at the same rhythm. All the other cells nearby are vibrating at that same rhythm. They start entraining each other into this state of peacefulness. When we let go, we're more peaceful. And so what's happening also, let's not leave out our receptors, we're in that state of peacefulness, our molecular pharmacy is changing. The molecules that also send peacefulness, we have more of those available than if we're, half of our brain is struggling and our liver is struggling, and suddenly we're just into that, thank God I'm here. And the cells applaud you when that's it. They say, yay, you got here. Come back again.
Now, one of the things that I'm not quite clear on is you talked about cell death, when the cells are no longer attached. Can you help me understand that?
Sure. Well, first of all, most of us are afraid of dying, but a natural process of cell life is that they die. And in normal cell death, some people say it's apoptosis. I call it apoptosis. It's a very gentle process. It's assisted suicide, if you will. The cells, it's also the ultimate recycle, because in natural cell death, the cells are sort of blebbing off, and all the pieces that can be reused are reused, and the rest goes, in our pee and our poop, and we don't need it anymore. So our cells have a program for death, natural death. When do our cells normally use it? When we're in the embryo stage, and you can picture we once had fins. What gives us fingers is cell death in that place in between our fingers. If in the developing brain, if a neuron, a cell in the brain, doesn't connect to other cells, it programs death. So in development again, and embryologically, when the thymus, which is the seat of the immune system or the regulator of the immune system, if there are cells in the thymus that will attack us, those cells are programmed to die. So it's a natural process. Our normal cells they're going to reproduce about 50 times, and then they're programmed to die, programmed to recycle. It's like, now give up your ingredients to somebody else who needs it. Mm-hmm. So I don't. Does that clarify the question?
Yeah, that's helping me. I guess I'm trying to understand, as you were talking about cancer and the power of letting go, and especially letting go of something, huge in your life. And of course, I've heard this from other people that I've interviewed, the power of forgiving someone at a very, very deep level, something we've been holding on to, or some other kind of burden we've been carrying that we're quite bitter about, that there can be profound healing effects when people let go. I'm trying to understand, though, when a cell dies, is that positive, negative? It can be both, and how that relates, let's say, to a situation like cancer and cancer cells.
Well, in cancer, what we know about cancer now is that we've had a cancer cell needs multiple genetic changes, gene changes, before it becomes a cancer cell. It's not one gene change that makes the cancer cell. And what we have learned in some of the cancers, some of the gene changes relate to, these cells don't die. They've become immortal. They're expressing gene programs that don't let them die when they should. And can we change that gene program to one that facilitates their death or facilitates their growing up? In the days when I had a laboratory at UC California in San Francisco, my last couple of years of research was seeing, can we make cancer cells? Basically the question I was asking is, can we make cancer cells die or grow up? Do we have to always use cytotoxic chemicals that are, killing more than the cancer cells? So I was able in the laboratory to basically take human cancer cells and convince them, if you will, with normal chemicals like vitamin A to change some of their expression. We didn't know as much about genes then as we did now, but I saw that, we can take these cancer cells from a person out of their body, put it in the laboratory, give them a non-toxic chemical, and now these cancer cells that only showed immature properties and only showed a rigidity in their physical structures, now suddenly some of those cells showed properties that they've become mature cells. They'd shifted some of their abilities, if you will. They grew up. So the question becomes now, can we shift them further? One, to either reinstate the program for cell death or turn off the program that says you have to keep on reproducing themselves. And I mean, what we're seeing in the cancer world, separate from, not separate from the cell, understanding the cell, is that, scientists are showing if we change the environment, again, a lot of it's in the test tube, if we change the environment that the cancer cells are on, it changes what they do. For instance, Valerie Weaver at the University of Pennsylvania showed that if she put breast cancer cells on a rigid environment, that they kept on expressing breast cancer genes. But if she put them on basically the equivalent of a soft pillow, Jell-O, they no longer express their cancer genes. So to me, the world of helping people heal with cancer, we can extrapolate what's happening in the world of ourselves. And I always, it's because, one of my pathways was to start working in groups with people with cancer, even though I was a scientist, or am a scientist, I'm not sure which, is that we don't make people feel guilty by saying, well, if you only were less rigid, or if you only let go of your attachments, then your cancer would disappear. I think that's always a danger of saying, well, if you only let go of something big, you haven't done it, so you're going to die of your disease. It's like, how do we talk about this so it empowers people? Where do I let go of my rigidity? To take it. Where do I let go of my rigidity? What am I holding on to I don't need to hold on to? Does that make me feel better? Does the cancer disappear or not? How do I feel better? It's like going into that deep letting go place you're talking about. We feel better there. Does that reverse our diseases? Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that I'm not clear about is you're talking about how cells can die or they can grow up or mature. You've used that phrase. I'm a little unclear.
Right.
What does that mean for a cell to grow up or mature? Okay.
Great question. Let's look at the immune cells to start with. If the cells are, if a white blood cell is given, a signal that there's a virus in the area, the first thing that family of immune cells are going to do, they're going to keep on reproducing, so we have lots and lots of immune cells, lymphocytes, to be able to recognize that virus. So there's that reproductive phase. But now if we want that immune cell to be able to really do its work, instead of its work of reproduction, if we wanted to do its work, it's got to make a whole lot of other kinds of chemicals and signals to be able to destroy the virus or virus-infected cells. So that's a property of a mature cell. So the lymphocyte goes through a reproductive phase to make more of what we need, and then it's like, okay, we have to stop reading the reproductive program, and we read the program of time to grow up, time to be the adult. What's your purpose? Why are you here? Oh, my purpose is to produce all these molecules and signals that are going to eradicate the virus infection. So it's turning, the immune cell has the programs to reproduce, has the programs to mature, but it can only do one or the other, one at a time. Mm-hmm. So it turns off the reproductive cycle to now I'm grown up. Now I got to do my job, and then when I'm finished doing my job, me as that cell is going to program time to leave, make space for other cells, and I program death.
Okay. So letting go of our attachments, letting go in a big way, that's one of the things that the cells can teach us, how valuable that is. What else would you say we can learn from our cells?
Well, I think one of the other places is I go into this place of understanding resonance and being able to entrain ourselves in a state of peacefulness. And, it sounds true. It's not surprise that one of the things I've learned from the cells is that sound helps our cells go to that place of peacefulness. And that sound, and when I started working with sound, I've got to be very honest, I was super uncomfortable because I never knew how it worked. And I didn't want to get lost into the physics of sound. But when I would work with sound in groups of people, like use sound to go to a part of your body that feels like it's pain, you feel pain. and people would get it, and they'd say, oh, I could really feel that place in my body, or I'm still practicing with the sound, and sound is the only thing that relieves my pain. That it's that basic elemental design of our cells that now, again, I keep on going back to that same structure, that same fabric, because we have in our cells now this place that we know where sound works. It isn't just changing the brain waves. It isn't just getting us up to dance. We have this structure that resonates with sound. And what we know, if you've drummed, you know that you start drumming, the nearby drum head is going to start responding to that, and tuning fork is going to respond to other sounds that are in the same sort of vibe, that our cells have a way to respond to sound. And to me, that becomes more important probably than anything else, because it's showing me that a lot of the healing strategies that have evolved over ages that might look like now new agey kinds of things. Yeah, but we have a structure in our cells that can respond to it. We're not just saying, well, sound is good for you. For me, who's been an eternal skeptic, it made me see that it made it more real. It made these healing practices like Qigong or yoga. We've got structures that respond to that. We're not just saying, oh, because people have done it for thousands of years, that's why it's good. The modern person, I think, wants to have, well, show me how it works in the cell. Show me how it works. And you can experience the sound by, playing music that makes you feel good or slows you down or speeds you up or depresses you. And it's not just what we're getting through our ears and our brain. It's like, oh, well, I can feel my cell. I can imagine my cells responding to music that puts me into a sacred place, a mantra. Where's mantra being responded to at a cellular level? Oh, well, we've got the place.
Mm-hmm. Now, what you're saying is very wild, Sondra, so I want to see if I understand it. So what you're saying is that in all the cells of my body, these cells have a fabric. That fabric is made of strings, and those strings are resonating with sound such that all the cells in my body could be coming into some type of peacefulness or resonant state. And that's happening at the cellular level, and we know that now because the intelligence lives in these strings.
Yep, you got it.
That's
now,
pretty,
why is that wild?
I think that it makes me have the experience that all the cells in my body are listening in a certain kind of way, and I think that's a wild thought.
Well, they are. I'll tell you an interesting experience about listening, because I've certainly used the cells as my teachers. And when I hear somebody, what usually happens is my mind goes into the critic. I'm kind of criticizing them, judging them. I've got this conversation going on in my head. And the awareness of cells are listening all the time, I started paying attention. God, am I listening, or am I having 14 other conversations going on? And so it has brought me back to, can I just listen? So perfect example, and I do that much better now. Perfect example is yesterday a friend came into my office and she saw the book. I received the galleys on Monday. And she saw the book, and the first thing she did was criticize it. All the things, because she's been in publishing, and all the things. And my tendency has always...
Well, clearly we don't want to listen to her. Clearly we're not listening to her.
Clearly no.
All my cells are saying no.
Definitely not. But, usually I become defensive and I react, or I've got all this stuff going on in my head, and I just sat there and, it's like, okay, that's what she does. I know she's a critic. She left my office, and I thought, okay, just really let it go. I mean, I must have been in such a different state, because a couple of hours later, she came back into my office and says, congrats on the book. It's really good. I'm sorry I was so critical. And I didn't do anything differently, except I didn't go into my internal reactive mode. I was listening. So all of my cells, I must have set up a different field, if you will, that changed, that she could change. I mean, it was when I shared the story with a mutual friend, she was shocked, because she knows this woman never apologizes. And I was like, okay, listening, getting into the habit of listening has changed my field, has changed with the energy. I mean, the other part of the cellular fabric is they're just not responding to what's outside. They're the resonators. They're also sending out, like the heart math work talks about the electromagnetic field of our brain and our heart. And, well, each cell has that. Basically, think about each cell has their heart and sending out a field of energy that allows somebody else to respond differently, starting with our cells, ourself.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're saying something very interesting to me here. Do the cells in our heart send out a different magnetic field than cells in different parts of our body, cells in the brain or cells in tissues, etc.?
Well, according to heart math, they're a much bigger magnetic field. So they may have more power to, and since I'm just sort of thinking out loud to your question, since they're muscle cells, they're going to have more of this fabric than, say, liver cells. So, meaning they've got more strings to play. So they may send out more of those messages and more of those vibes in the field. I mean, the heart math work, the work of Paul Pearsall, who talks about the mind and the heart, and the people who get heart transplants, some percentage of them, the people who get heart transplants, pick up some of the behaviors, at least short term, pick up some of the behaviors of the person who gave them the heart. Is it in the field, of those cells and the intelligence of the cells? Are they still beating out that? I'd say yes, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are cells that have more power because they have more strengths. But one of the practices I teach, which is probably the most important, is this gratitude practice, where ultimately you're getting into the heart of you're getting to your heart, and you're remembering an experience of gratitude, or feeling grateful for something that someone else did, and people can get to that experience. It's an embodied experience, and then saying, well, let's use that heart to send out the communication to all the other cells. Experience that heart that's in a place of gratitude can set up all the other cells listening to the same story. Like, oh, okay, that's kind of a cool idea. I can do that. I've done it when I've really needed to. I've seen it useful, and people after I was scheduled to teach in all the places that were hit after 9/11. Not something I wished I had to do, because it was going into warfare, and I was totally strung out in terms of, oh my God, how am I going to teach health professionals to come to a place of peacefulness when I'm freaked out myself of what's happened? What do I have to give them? And the insight was, give them this simple gratitude exercise. Get them into their heart. Does that bring them to a place of peacefulness? Because I didn't think science was going to help them. And I was really surprised to see, it's different when you're working with 10 people in a group, but when you're working with 200 in a hotel room, I'm always, it's like, what are people going to get when you're in a room full of strangers, especially after such the attack that we had in this country? So for me, it's like, well, I've learned some things that even under those conditions, I could go in, I was going into my heart, into that place and getting my whole body to be in an entrained state or a resonant state. It's like, okay, I'm in peacefulness for at least the hours I'm teaching. I could at least transmit that or send that to these people who need it. They don't need, like I say, they don't need science for CEUs. They needed support.
Now, Sondra, you said something that I was unfamiliar with. I'd never really heard, actually, that there were strings in this fabric inside the cells, but that our heart cells have more strings than other cells in our body.
I'm just guessing. Guessing because they're muscles, and the muscles are strings, basically. The muscle proteins, actin and myosin, the things that cause, if you think about cells that whose work is to contract and relax, that's that mechanical tension again on the strings of the cell. And the strings aren't just in the fabric of the cell for a heart cell. The heart cell has all this musculature that creates its structure. So there's got to be, it's like I'd never thought about the question until you asked it.
Uh-huh.
So there's definitely more structures that would respond, that are able to respond to sound, to emitting electromagnetic fields.
Now, Sondra, there's actually a lot of things that I want to talk with you about, so we're going to have another conversation soon. So that'll have to happen. But in the meanwhile, just to wrap up this first part of our conversation, I wonder if you think that there's any danger, if you will, in studying cells, seeing what they do, and then saying, and humans are like that too. Meaning, if we studied atoms and we said, well, humans are like atoms, or if we took a different part in the evolutionary chain and just presumed that humans were like this previous building block, because obviously these are building blocks of something bigger. So I'm wondering if you think there's any danger in this approach.
I don't think there's any danger. I think one of the dangers, and I've had it from my own, in terms of my own expression, is, are we talking about intelligent design when we say we're like ourselves, or our molecules have information? And so for me, the intelligent design people are so at the other end of science and denying evolution or the reality of who we are that I never, the danger for me is I don't want people who are trying to understand cells or saying we're like ourselves to just put us into the intelligent design camp, because it's not. And I think, it's like, for me, it's like knowing Bruce Lipton's work. Bruce was probably the first person I ever heard who talked about cells work in cooperation. That was an aha moment to hear that. It gave me insight into, of course, that's more of the story. Cells aren't competing with each other. Normal cells don't compete with each other at all. Cancer cells, well, they're not normal. They're competing for resources. But the rest of us is really cooperating and in alignment as much as possible. So I don't see the danger other than putting it into the camp of, this is one more woo-woo person talking about, well, we're just like ourselves. I see it as, I see it in a way as divine guidance. That as above, so below. We can learn from who we are at that level. We're more than that, and they can teach us. I mean, they're, like I say in the book, they're our oldest living ancestors. Why not learn from them?
Sondra, in the first part of our conversation, we talked about the part of ourselves that might be listening, might be vibrating, might be a knowing part of ourselves. And you described this in terms of the cytoskeleton inside the cell, and how the cytoskeleton has this string-like material that vibrates. And, this is the first that I had heard of this description of the knowing part of the cell being this stringed material of the cytoskeleton. And I'd love to know if there are other researchers and scientists who are confirming this view that you have.
Well, it actually wasn't my view to start with. It was the first place I read about it was actually in a Scientific American article by Harvard scientist Donald Ingbar. And and it was one of those synchronicity moments of going to the bookstore first and discovering two magazines, totally unrelated, Yoga Journal and Scientific American. And both of them had articles in there about something called tensegrity, which I had never heard of. One was an article by Carlos Castañeda, who talked about magical passes, which are physical exercises, basically, that the ancient sorcerers used to change their consciousness and to supposedly change their bodies. Ingbar uses the word tensegrity, which totally transformed how I've even thought about the cell. I had never heard it when I studied biology. And tensegrity basically is a principle of design or a principle of architecture that says the forces inside of a structure must be balanced with the outside forces to maintain integrity. A physical example, before I get into the cells, probably a long-winded answer, is Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome. In fact, he coined the term tensegrity. Mm-hmm. It's a very stable structure. And what Ingbar did was he, from a cellular perspective, he was able to discover in the test tube that if you put cells in a plastic dish and they stretched out, and what allows them to stretch out is this fabric or the cytoskeleton. And the cytoskeleton is really, let's say, it's really the probably the most complex structure in this of the cell, because it's strings, it's tubes. People are probably very familiar, or some of your listeners might be familiar with the term microtubules, microfilaments. So it's a matrix of a variety of thicknesses of stringy material, if you will, which the microtubules, part of that, we've known for decades that they've been essential for directing the cell's movement. Most cells can move and go from one place to another. So that directed the shape change that has to happen, as well as the movement that happens. And then what Ingbar did, to me, was phenomenal. He showed that when the cells are stretched out in the dish, where they had to fill the Petri dish, their fabric is stretched out, and that they're sending out, and what that does is then change trigger which genes should be expressed. So when the cells are spread out, the cytoskeleton is triggering the genes to reproduce. Just like if we get a cut, the cells have to stretch out to fill the space, and the cells, those and epithelial cells, have to reproduce, make more copies. Then what Ingvar was able to show that if the cells let go of a little bit of the tension, that they stopped reproducing and they started maturing. So they were expressing a different genetic code, in other words, another gene program. And if the cells totally let go of all of their attachments to the dish, they would ball up and die. So what's phenomenal is that if we kind of extrapolate, what I've been saying in the book is that the cytoskeleton is the regulator of gene expression. It's mechanical input influences which genes will be expressed. So Ingvar wrote that in 1998, and there have been hundreds of scientists since then who've been looking at the importance of the cytoskeleton in genetic expression, breakdowns in this fabric, if you will, in cancer, some of the and one of the things we've known in in the old days of cancer treatment, people were given, especially in leukemias, they would be given something called vincristine or vinblastine, which basically kept the microtubules from doing their change and development of the growing more cells. So let me see what else. Well, and what also is interesting to me about this whole phenomenon, because I extrapolate it into more spiritual teachings, if you will, for cells to grow, they have to attach. They can't just grow in a ball. So they have to, and when they are going to attach, they send out, sticky proteins that keep them attached. And I remember when I had a lab and I was, trying to grow cells, we would have to change the plastic in the cell in the dish to make sure that the cells could actually stick. And if I kind of taken it to the next place, when the cells let go of their attachments, now they can become mature. And I'm not a Buddhist. I know a little bit about Buddhism, and one of the concepts in Buddhism is, let go of your attachments and you will be more spiritually mature. So, early on I was thinking, are the cells guiding the way? Are they showing the way for some of these spiritual teachings? Where did the idea come from in the first place? Of course, psychology and spirituality, and may have nothing to do with ourselves other than our perspective. So let me see what else about the intelligence. So when we think about then what cells are able to do, it's affected by the matrix of the cell. It is, and I've been thinking since we spoke last about, is it just the cell membrane that is receiving and the chemicals that tell the cell what to do? Is that more important than the cytoskeleton or the innards of the cell, if you will? It's like, no, they really do work in collaboration to be a combined intelligence, if you will.
There's a lot that you're saying that I want to make sure that I'm following you, so I'm going to take it a little slow here. So when you talked about Carlos Castaneda and these tensegrity movements and exercises that you saw in Yoga Journal, help me understand the connection between those physical exercises, these tensegrity exercises, and what you're saying about the tensegrity in the cell.
Great question. What Castaneda did, and he never talks about tensegrity in the cell. He talks about these are tensegrity movements. And basically what these movements are, if you look at a book on magical passes or their videos, the body, people are making changes in their postures or flexing their wrists. They're really changing the tension in their musculature. They're changing their tissues. They're changing their postures. So they're physically changing their bodies. And he, claimed that by physically changing your body, you're changing consciousness. And Felicitas Goodman was an anthropologist, who looked at pre-Columbian art, and she had students adapt the different postures in this art, because she was hypothesizing that the postures that a body took influenced what state of consciousness somebody went into, and saw, in fact, different ways of sitting or holding your hands or your head or your legs influenced their mind state, their spiritual state. So Castañeda is talking about basically physical postures changing a sense of what's going on in ourselves, the interior. And if we look at what the cells are doing, we're showing that when the cells change their shape and their tension, and they can be changed totally mechanically, that changes who they become. Where I've leaped is, then what that shows is that the practices that are age-old practices like yoga and qigong, shamanic dance, those are all ways that people have used for generations to change consciousness, to feel better, to create healing. And it wasn't just some esoteric property that people are using to do that. Our cells do that.
Okay, so Sondra, I'm totally with you when you talk about being in different body postures, and there are different kinds of consciousness, states of consciousness, different types of sensitivities, sensibilities that are present dependent on the posture we're in. So I'm completely with you. I think what I don't yet understand is how cells change their shape and what shapes are available to cells. Meaning I understand, the human body can sit up straight or twist or do a headstand.
Right.
But how do our cells change shapes? What shapes are available to the cells of the body?
Oh, great. Well, the cells I have the most experience with, besides in my imagination in the laboratory, are white blood cells. And simple example is a white blood cell that gets rid of bacteria, our first line of defense, basically looks sort of like an amoeba. But when a microbe gets into its environment, or a plastic bead gets into its environment, this now amoeba, if you've seen amoeba, on video or something like that, you see it change shape, it oozes, it goes after its prey. So cells, one, are always in a state of movement. We might not see it all. And when they're moving, they're changing shape. Some will become more elongated, stretched out. Some will be, if you look at all the different shapes in the body, of cellular shapes, it's pretty phenomenal that the shape, their function dictates their shape. So cells, their overall shape. So cells that are building up our skin are more like blocks. Cells that have to move through the body, like the white blood cells, the neutrophils and the lymphocytes, can become more oozy and amoeba-like. Red blood cells that carry the oxygen through the body look more like flying saucers. And another example of how a cell changes shape related to its health or well-being. When the red cell is carrying oxygen throughout the body, if it gets starved of oxygen, it starts changing its shape and putting out little, what's called spicules, little spikes all over the cell surface to be able to access more, to have more cell surface to access more oxygen. So I'm always amazed at how do they know to do that? What influences these cells to, one, detect the change in their environment and influence what they look like or what they're able to do. And so many of the cells are shape-shifting when they go on to do their, mature action, if you will.
Okay, so I'm still just wanting to make sure that I'm following this line of inquiry. So I get how when the human body is in different configurations, there's different kinds of consciousness associated with those different ways of posture, lying down, etc. And I get that the cells have different shapes. But what would you say would be the quote-unquote consciousness or knowing of cells depending on their shapes? I mean, you talked about the shape of a cell that's oxygen deprived. What would be the shape of, I don't know, could you call it a happy cell, or is there such a thing? I don't know. Help me here understand this.
A great question. I wish I could. I wish I knew the answer to that. Are there shapes of happy cells? In our imagination, I am sure there are shapes of happy cells. And, I think I mentioned last time that Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose talked about the consciousness of a cell. And the microtubules of the cell, according to their theory, is what carries consciousness. Now, these microtubules, we know, which is phenomenal, because we think if these cells are changing shape, this might be part of your question, why aren't we changing shape? And what happens at this microcosmic level? I mean, we're made of trillions of cells. A millimeter of skin is, 1 million cells. So they're numbers we can't fathom, and one of the things that is even harder for me to understand as a, biologist is these microtubules in cells. So they're the regulators of intelligence, if you will, at the cellular level. Some of them dismantle and rebuild every 10 minutes. So the cells are in constant state of flux and change. And again, my extrapolation is, then this does explain the quantum healing idea, because these cells are fluid. They're not fixed just like the genes are not fixed in time or space. The cells can change the messages they're receiving and acting upon in nanoseconds. I mean, I don't understand the quantum, let alone the nano world. But our cells are operating in that world. Are there happy cells? Of course.
Now, it's interesting because as we're having this conversation, you're willing to shift, I'll use the word quite fluidly, to use the word you introduced in talking about how quickly the cells change, this fluidity. You're willing to shift between, there's our imagination, and then there's what we see under the microscope. And we can talk about both in the same sentence. And I know some people are uncomfortable with that. Even some people here at Sounds True, I have to say. They're like, you're talking to the cellular shaman. And I feel, for whatever reason, at home, talking to the cellular shaman and switching between the worlds of imagination and the worlds of looking under a microscope. But I'm curious, what do you think about that? What do you think of this term, the cellular shaman, and this idea that we can have a conversation that blends both imagination and what's actually visibly present when we look under a microscope?
Well, when I first started teaching the bridge material, I was calling myself a cellular shaman because, one, I was studying with a shaman at the time, and I was struggling with how can I believe what my imagination is saying or my intuition? Where is that information coming from? I still have a struggle with that. Like, you're making that up. I thought I was making up a lot of the cell stuff. I mean, where is this information coming from? But I think in the Western world anyway, we're so opinionated about, if we can't prove it, it's not real. If we can't measure it, if we can't see it through the microscope, and I sure started that way. If I can't analyze something and reproduce what I'm trying to, discover, it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. But if we look at, centuries and centuries of indigenous people who've had their shamanic ways of knowing the body, or knowing about healing, or knowing healing plants, we're beginning to see that more and more of that's important. And if we're talking about consciousness, isn't consciousness about imagination too? I mean, how do we measure consciousness? Are we awake? Maybe that's consciousness. But, my experience with imagery probably gave me more of a belief that the imagination works, even though it's an ancient practice. Not even though, perhaps because it's an ancient practice. And I'll give you one example. I'll give you two examples, because one was when I was first starting to teach this material, I got an awful rash on my arm, and nothing could get rid of it. Cortisone cream, changing fabric softener, changing the detergent, nothing. And I had been teaching imagery to kids at UC California, and I thought, well, if you're teaching kids imagery, why don't you use it for yourself besides worrying? So I closed my eyes, and immediately popped up into my imagination was this little elf. He called himself Mortimer, and he said he was going to clean this rash out from the inside out. It's like, oh, sure, go ahead. I have nothing to lose. Nothing else has worked, because I had the rash for weeks. And he cleans out the rash. I don't feel anything. I'm just paying attention to him. Next day, no change. But 2 days later, the rash is gone. I thought, how cool is that? And it stayed gone for a couple of weeks until I went to meet with a oncologist colleague of mine to talk about mind, body, and imagery and healing. And he said, oh, I have a whole file on that, and it was called Quackery. And as soon as I got the Quackery file, the rash returned. So it was like, okay, I can use imagery to help remove or heal my body, and I can lose that belief. So belief is part of consciousness. I think belief is part of our imagination. I can lose that belief by somebody else's input if I think they're more of an expert than me. Certainly I thought an MD has more expertise than I did in healing. And this weekend, sort of the other true story, was it my imagination? I'm not sure. This weekend I got an awful, awful spider bite. It looked like it was from a brown recluse spider. And I was terrified, and my leg was swelling up, and it was getting redder and redder and painful. And I was putting, hydrocortisone, Benadryl cream and stuff like that on it. And it wasn't really healing. Again, an anecdotal story. It could be, well, it would have healed on its own. And I was so scared, because it's like, oh, is this really one of those poisonous spiders going to wipe me out? I just meditated on my leg and asked my cells to please go there and stop the process, because this was moving up it was getting towards my knee, and it was down by my ankle. I was terrified. And, the next day it was concentrated, in one big red spot. So again, it gave me a sense of managing my own health, that I could engage my imagination or my belief, or is this the placebo effect? I don't know. but it gave me more a sense of controlling what was happening in my body. Did my cells really respond to me? I don't know.
Now, Sondra, I think one of the reasons that people perhaps get a little squirmy when you start talking about belief there are so many examples when our beliefs aren't true and things don't work. And so this is pretty risky territory to say, I'm just going to, quote unquote, believe that this imagery will work. I mean, how do you work with all of the disappointment when people have taken on beliefs about healing right to their grave?
You're asking really an important question, because there was a period of time, and it may still exist in the literature, it's mind over matter. That if you, like what you're just asking, if you believe the right things, then you're going to get better from your disease. Because that's usually when we're using belief. People want to heal their cancer. And to me, belief is just one part of the equation. One of the parts of the equation is, what's the great mystery have in store for us? How are we supposed to live? And can we use our mind in a way that allows healing to happen, but the physical healing may not change. But it can be, what happens at the spiritual level. So I know I've been angry myself at a lot of physicians who've talked about, you created your disease. If you believed something differently, you would get rid of your disease. It's not that simple. To me, belief looks at, part of it is, it looks at our attitudes. Do we think we have an ability to shift how we're looking at something, our perspective at looking at something? And what do we have to learn from this? I mean, the people I've worked with the most are people who've had cancer. And one of the frequent statements they would make was, it was a gift to them because it made them reprioritize their life. Their imagery, their beliefs may not have changed their dying from cancer, and I saw too many still die from cancer with all the things they were doing, quote, right. But, what do we have to heal besides our body is our spirit. Mm-hmm. And I think belief plays a big part in our spirit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I probably went round and around with that because I don't have a real answer of how do we not have people feel guilty for not being able to shift their belief or hold their beliefs. And, there's so many subconscious beliefs we don't even know we've got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you, though, for just helping unpack the whole conversation around the power of belief. Now, when I was talking to you about this way that you weave together the imagination and the actual biological data, you could say, of what we can observe under a microscope, you said, well, we're talking about consciousness here, and what is consciousness but imagination? I thought that was a very interesting comment, and I wanted to tease that out. I'm not sure that most people listening may or may not agree. What is consciousness but imagination? Can you explain that, what you mean by that?
Well, I think consciousness is really a hard word to define in the first place. To me, consciousness embraces any activity of the mind. It embraces just being awake and going through your everyday life. It embraces a higher state of consciousness, could embrace when you're in a state of meditation or prayer or sitting in a temple or a church with people or out in nature. Your consciousness, your mind changes. And to me then, imagination, intuition are all part of that same gestalt, if you will, of it's the invisible. It's the immeasurable, or it's kind of immeasurable. And it's not so invisible. Sort of going back over remembering some of the science of some of the early science showing that imagery, which is the use of imagination, makes changes in the brain. And in this set of experiments, they had given people radioisotopes of glucose that when you look at what's called PET scans of the brain, you can see which parts of the brain are working by this radioactive glucose. So they would have people look at a picture in a book, and they would see which parts of the brain lit up when people were actually looking at the picture. Then they closed their eyes, and they either remembered or imagined the picture, and the same areas of the brain lit up. So to me, that's also showing that imagination is real. Mm-hmm. It's a state of consciousness. Another example of imagination being real, for those who are like to imagine sexual experiences, their body will change. If we imagine being caught in traffic, or for me, the example with the spider bite, I'm imagining dying of a spider bite, that changes our physiology. It puts you into a state of stress, anxiety, so it's real. We're not so much in Western medicine experienced with measuring it or talking about it. I mean, let's face it, maybe it's only in the past 20 years mind has been included with body. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was, in the early 90s, it was still body. We weren't saying mind had anything to do with body. So mind, consciousness, to me, they're about the same thing. Different states of mind and consciousness.
Are you comfortable with being introduced Sondra Barrett, the biochemist and cellular shaman?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, let me keep going here then with this conversation with the first cellular shaman I've ever had the chance to speak to, which is we were talking a little bit about gene expression, and you were saying how it's not determined that genes will get expressed through the cells. They may or may not, depending on certain factors. So help me understand, what are the factors within the cell that determine whether genetic material is expressed or not?
Well, it's a couple things. So one of the things that influences which genes are expressed, if you sort of go back to, we all started as one fertilized cell with one set of, a set of genes. And that cell kept on dividing and dividing, and by virtue of the location in the embryo, different genes were expressed. They all had the same genes, but only, the heart cell expresses the genes necessary to build those cells and make the proteins that those cells make. So, and only, the liver has the same identical genes as the heart. But obviously, some of them are turned off. We don't need the heart genes to be expressed. So one of the things we know in the normal human body, location of the cells will influence which genes are expressed, which is interesting. The other thing that's becoming even more interesting from my perspective, and probably from a lot of people's experience, is what's called the epigenetic phenomenon. And the epigenetic phenomenon is one that tells us, if we eat certain foods, we change the expression of our genes. One example is something called methyl donors. I don't need to get too complicated by that, but these are compounds that are found in garlic and onions. And in animals, when pregnant mice were given, pre-pregnant mice were given these kinds of chemicals, although they had a lethal gene, a gene that made them sick and made their offspring sick and fat and yellow, when they were fed these chemicals, we'll say from onions, that even though the mamas had these strange genes and their babies had these strange genes, the babies didn't express the genes that made them fat and sick and yellow. And the babies' offsprings also had the same genes, but didn't express them. So we're learning through this a very exciting field that's showing, wow, what we do in our lifestyle can actually change the expression of our genes. Mm-hmm. The genes are there, and basically what these lifestyle changes are doing is influencing the on-off switch. Mm-hmm. Dean Ornish has done a really exciting set of studies with men with prostate cancer. He measured some of the prostate cancer gene proteins, and then he put them on his usual way of lifestyle, change your diet, group support, meditation, exercise, and 3 months later, the expression of some of those prostate cancer genes was decreased just by lifestyle change. So those, to me, it's like, there are factors, that's why it's like moving. To me, it's like, that's why, the cellular shaman, that's why doing yoga or doing qigong or using sound, if all of those can impact our genes at the level of expression, why not use them? Mm-hmm. Maybe they will keep us healthier.
So, Sondra, I want to ask you a question, and this is based on a poetic leap, and it's a poetic leap that I've made in my own mind, but now we're talking cellular shaman to person who makes poetic leaps, and just curious what you think about this, which is that just like an individual human body is made up of trillions of cells, there might be something that we could consider a type of cosmic body that is made up of human individuals, like human individuals are cells in this bigger body. And I'm curious if you think that type of leap actually has any merit when you study the way cells are and how they work together in the human body.
Well, I think it's an incredible question, because if we think of, one of these sayings that say, healing starts with me. So if I look at myself as a cell in the universe, whatever I'm projecting, thinking, doing influences the neighboring cells, my neighbors, my friends, my family, which impacts then their neighbors, friends, etc. So we are a cosmic cell, if you will, a cosmic universe made up of cosmic cells. In fact, the other day, a friend of mine, actually my shaman teacher, had sent out an email, and I had replied to it saying, well, we have a cosmic CIA, or we are a cosmic CIA. I call it cellular intelligence agencies. Better that CIA than the other. And we're cosmic with that. We influence. So our cells in our body, hopefully in the best of all worlds, they are cooperating and they're keeping us whole and healthy. And how I can influence the cosmic universe is to be more in my heart and less reactive, and eating sustainably, not buying foods that are pesticides. It's like everything each one of us does for sustaining life influences our universe. And I think if we saw that, maybe we take better care of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, another area that I'm really interested to know some of your discoveries in has to do with cells and sacred art. And I know this is something that you've looked at a lot, how various visionary artists throughout history seem to have produced art that looks similar to what cells look like under a microscope. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and share with us some of your discoveries that you've made.
Well, if we look at, for me, the first place where I even imagined sacred art being related to cells was seeing a medicine wheel in the Southwest. I was photographing pictographs and petroglyphs, and it was an aha moment seeing this image that I know about medicine wheels that could just as easily be an abstract picture of a cell. And so it triggered me to looking at other kinds of art, like the Sri Yantra. Looks like, if you look at it, in fact, I've had something going on in an art science LinkedIn discussion of looking at the Sri Yantra and the computer graphic of DNA from Robert Langridge. They look a lot alike. The structure is the same. So when I started doing, sort of the leap, it made me wonder, where did the art come from people really visioning inside? Did they use their imagination? Not that in 2,000 years ago, or I think the medicine wheel, the one I first saw, was 1,000 years old. Not that 1,000 years ago people were going inside and saying, "Oh, I'm seeing my cells." They didn't have a clue. They knew they were seeing their inner universe. And did their ability to see the innards get expressed in the outside world to be able to, a lot of the art, old art, was to really be able to touch into the sacred, be able to focus on God. And so we're going in and seeing the God within, or the divinity or the sacred nature within, and it's coming outside in our art. And another leap from around the art was probably the hardest thing for me to really be willing to hold was years ago. New friends had insisted I photograph minerals related to astrology. One, I had no belief in astrology, and I thought they were nuts to ask me to do this. But since at the time I was, showing slideshows to kids with cancer, I thought, okay, I'll photograph the minerals, and they can use it for astrology, and I'll use it for my slideshows for these kids. And when I photographed the 12 mineral salts, that, there's a whole long story on that. Hopefully that's the next book. When I photographed these 12 salts, I saw 4 shapes. And again, I had no belief, so I couldn't bias what I was photographing. But I am someone who's been trained as a microscopist and someone who likes to categorize things. And I said, well, where is 4-ness? Is there any kind of quality of 4 in astrology? And I said, it's the 4 elements. Well, let's see what the 4 elements are. Air, water, fire, earth. And it was shocking to me that, the minerals associated with earth signs were all round. The minerals associated with air signs were all square. Water minerals were squiggly, and hexagons were for the fire signs. And it was like, how is this possible? Using a microscope in, 1979 or whenever I did it, photographing minerals that were given, astrological meaning 300 years ago, how is it possible that they actually symbolically, the microscopic images match the symbology of those elements? And
Sondra, help me out here. Just tell me, what are the minerals that you photographed?
The minerals were the 12 mineral salts in the body. Sodium phosphate, sodium sulfate, potassium phosphate. So,
okay, and in astrology, each one of those minerals is associated with a different astrological sign. That's part of...
Exactly.
Okay.
Somewhere probably around 1,000 years ago, astrologers gave, what they basically said, oh, here, Saturn rules the bones. So they were looking at the different planets that they saw and attributed different, body parts to each planet. And somewhere in around the 17th century, somebody asked the human body and said there were 12 predominant salts, mineral salts, and then attributed them to different parts of the body or different, and then different astrological signs. It was not something I ever expected to research. But it certainly it was one of the first things that gave me pause of, where does this alchemical, occult language come from, this information come from? How do they know this? Then I, of course, went off on looking at a lot of other symbolic codes, if you will, in the micro world, like taste.
Now tell me what you're describing there, symbolic codes like taste? Yeah.
Well, if we look at the molecules of taste, I'll give you a question. If you tasted something sour, what geometric shape might you expect it to have?
Oh, I'd have to say, I don't really know, except I would imagine that it wouldn't be round and regular. It might have something sticking out or something like that.
Yep. And so the chemicals that are sour, like citric acid from a lemon or malic acid from a unripe grape or unripe apple, they're angular. Sugar is rounded. Bitter is prickly. Bitter caffeine is prickly. It's a whole language to me, a whole language. It's really going out there on the limb, if you will, of where does our language come from? Is it rooted in our biology? Carl Jung said our archetypes are rooted in our biology. Is our language rooted in our biology? Again, it goes back to that inner knowing. Where did the word sour come from? And that you expected it to be more angular. It is. Carol Jung wrote a wonderful book called Naming Nature, which she really goes into how do we categorize and name things, and some of that universal. It moves into the subtitle of the book. It's the universal instinctual intelligence that we have. That can get pretty. I can make it pretty heady, so I don't want to.
I'm curious. So clearly, this is something you've thought and reflected on quite a lot. Is your theory that the rishis in deep meditation received or saw or knew these things about the mineral salts, about the Sri Yantra diagram? And I mean, what is your theory about how is it that the Sri Yantra that was originally drawn thousands of years ago looks like DNA under a microscope? That's just amazing.
It's totally amazing. Well, they were able to allow the power of inner knowing and an inner intelligence guide them. We've moved into we have discounted that intelligence. It's going back to the battle of science versus intuition, or science versus imagination, or science versus the shaman. If we truly allow ourselves to know and get inside, I think we'd be much richer. That's one of the intentions of, me doing this book and me being grateful that you wanted to do the book. It's like, wow, if we only had an inkling of our intelligence, I can interpret it by ourselves because that's my background. But it's greater than that.
It still seems like, in general, people just aren't comfortable mixing science, poetry, shamanism, and putting it all into one stew. That's still, in general, it seems in the current cultural milieu, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I'm curious, you mentioned going out on a limb. Do you feel like you're going out on a limb, or are you comfortable out there at this point?
I think because I'm an elder at this point, I'm more willing to go out on a limb. But it is, there's a fear of being challenged. It's like, oh, could I really go back to the University of California and talk about this stuff? Well, I'm trying. I want to see if I can get programs into, medical schools. But I know I'm walking a very delicate path. And it's, for years I would never talk about this. Some of the blending, the cell, the astrology stuff or what our cells can tell us, so I know I'm going out, I'm sort of leaping, but why not?
I'm leaping here with you, Sondra, and I want you to know that. And I'm leaping.
Oh, thank you.
No, I really am. And I think it's important that we stand in some of these questions and are simply open to look and see some of the kinds of correlations you're bringing forward. I mean, if the Sri Yantra really looks like DNA under a microscope, and you're telling me that it does, people have to pause and consider that. That is just amazing. Is there anything else like that from sacred art that reflects what cells look like under a microscope? Well,
again, the pictograph of, I'm calling it DNA. It looks just like the spiral DNA. And if we look, at, again, the history of symbols, why is the spiral sacred in many cultures? Well, where do we find the spiral in our bodies? First, we find it in our DNA. And, we find it in galaxies, and we find it in seashells, and we find, it's one of those ideas, as above, so below. And we find it in our DNA. The other thing that sort of give me pause, and as long as I'm leaping, I will here too, is where did the idea for the Trinity come from? Why are there the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Why is there a three? Why is there a three in a lot of spiritual teachings? What's the threesome all about? And then you look at, what's the DNA code? It's a threesome. When we're embryos, we're 3 layers by 3 weeks. And you begin to see in biology the same symbols, if you will, are revealed over and over. We have 3 kinds of brains, 3 layers, the brain stem, the limbic system, and the cortex. So again, why is it all 3? Ancient Greek philosopher says it's only with 3 do we have completion. 1 is just solitary, 2 is polarized, and 1, 2, and 3. Well, again, then we go to culture. 1, 2, and 3, ABC. Why do we have 3 stoplights? 3 wishes. Where did that concept develop? Did it develop from our biology? That's way out there, I know, but it certainly gave me pause, like, another aha moment.
Well, when you're going to leap, you might as well leap all the way, huh?
Go for it.
Well, Sondra, just one last question. Our program's called Insights at the Edge, and I think that you fit right in. Clearly, you're sharing insights at the edge. But I'm always curious to know what someone's personal edge is. And what I mean by that in your case here with this work that you're bringing out. What's the edge for you? What's the questions you're asking? Where are you currently putting your attention?
Well, the edge for me is as I get older, I often look at what's my mythic self, and what's my legacy. And I have, in the corners of my house, called my mythic self the code finder. And that's my edge of, will I really allow that part of me, maybe it comes out in fiction, maybe it comes out in a film, in a DVD or a letter to my kids. What is the code finder? Part of it is, my belief has always been we're here for a purpose. And I certainly have had a very strange road I've traveled. And so I think the road I've traveled isn't just for me, obviously. I wouldn't be a cellular shaman. It's what can I bring to the world that makes it a better place. And as that mythic code finder, she's revealing, or she's had revealed to her that humans know a lot more than we think, and we are incredible, sacred, cosmic beings if we know how to tune into that.
You go, Code Finder. That's wonderful. I love it. I've been talking with Sondra Barrett with Sounds True. She has leaped publicly and written a new book called Secrets of Your Cells, Discovering Your Body's Inner Intelligence. And I'm so grateful, Sondra, for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been fun.
Your cells are listening. Many voices, one journey. SoundsTrue.com.